So the US and Israel are now into their 6th week of their war against Iran, and I think we have to say that according to their stated motives, it's spectacularally backfired. Apart from the absurd explanation that Israel was going to attack Iran and therefore Iran became an imminent threat to the US, if you remember that one, the war was about destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities, and in part to do that, regime change. The Iranian regime not only remains in place, but retains control of the Strait of Hormuz, which we all know about now, which has become the current focus of the negotiations in Islamabad, if they happen. One of the conditions for the ceasefire was for a ceasefire in Lebanon, and Israel is known for ignoring ceasefires and every other marker of a civilized society. But it also therefore has control of about 20 million barrels of oil per day that move through the state, roughly a quarter of the global seaborne oil trade, and over a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas also passes through it, not to mention fertilizer and everything. Now, that Iran has the world's 3rd largest proven crude oil reserves, only after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, that's about a quarter of oil in the whole of the Middle East, along with the 2nd largest proven natural gas reserves. This is all a problem for the US. So what this is really about is Iran's control over global energy in this strategic region, but also and equally its historical and ongoing defiance of the US. It dominates the Middle East in strategic ways, but it also has not cowed to US demands like Saudi Arabia and most of the other Gulf states have. It does not do the US's bidding. And if we look at the history of US interventions, particularly over the last 2 decades, but obviously going back to Vietnam and the litany of interventions in every part of the world during the Cold War, and the fact that the US was never a source of stability after the end of the Cold War, let alone a force for peace or democracy, then we have to see what is happening now as a structural part of the system. It is a product of the fact that the US was never able to compensate for its relative economic decline, even with its overwhelming military might. It has a national debt of $39 trillion, persistent inflation, people are not spending money because they don't have cash, they have debt. And one reason for that is that the US spends so much on war. Estimates are that the current military operation in Iran is costing roughly $1 billion a day. And then there's, of course, the rise of China, which is causing a relative decline in US manufacturing and technology development. This is what an empire looks like in decline. It's aggressive and brutal, erratic and out of control. And what does our government and most other European governments do in response? They're in an embarrassing and humiliating situation because they refuse to stand up to Trump and in defense of their own populations that they govern, who are fed up of endless war. And Starmer, for his part, is desperate to save this special relationship, and yet backing Trump's every demand would prove extremely unpopular and costly. So we need to continue to call him out. His lies about not being involved in the war when he's facilitating the bombing of Iran and Lebanon by allowing the US to use British bases. But he's also coordinating with other countries to force the Strait of Hormuz open. He emphasizes the political and diplomatic efforts, but it's also about being involved in a potential military escalation to do that. And who knows where that could lead. It's all extremely risky. So it's already costly in terms of the coming inflation, but it could also mean that war spreads well beyond the region. We are on a knife edge. It's almost certain that oil prices will creep back up again in what's being described by the International Energy Agency as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. And if you notice, actually, the IEA, what they were advising governments and businesses and households to do last month to alleviate the crisis is not dissimilar to what environmentalists have been calling for the past half century. Work from home, use public transport, reduce air travel, and so on. They aren't suggesting that this state of affairs should be made permanent, as they released 400 million barrels of oil from emergency reserve. But it's a tacit admission, if there ever was one, that how we organize our economy is not only completely wasteful, but utterly unstable. And some countries in Asia and Africa are already on emergency rationing, and European countries will have to think about potential shortages. Britain is particularly vulnerable because we rely on so much of our we rely so much on imported food and fertilizer, energy inputs, and global transport systems. And as has been repeatedly pointed out, if oil and gas installations continue to be hit, not to mention the desalination plants and the airports and other energy infrastructure, refineries and export terminals and so on, then oil prices will rise further. And it would be comparable to the 1970s oil shock that essentially gave rise to the neoliberal era. And if the conflict escalates to those attacks on energy infrastructure, we can be sure that it will affect everything from mortgages to the price of food. And it isn't just Britain, of course. Some 70% of Brazil's fertilizer imports and 40% of India's. These are huge populations which are essential to their agricultural sectors, come from the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. Gulf countries themselves import high percentages of food, including 75% of their rice and higher percentages for soybeans and vegetable oil and other things. And of course, you've got this knock-on impact for workers. Many millions from South Asia who work in the Gulf and send remittances back in their billions, who will be ultimately sending less back. So this is a huge crisis on every level. And while you could say, okay, all of this might lead to a diversification of energy supplies, an expansion of strategic reserves, at a domestic level, and an acceleration of renewable energy to think, okay, there might be some positive outcomes here. It will not mean the end of military confrontation over the control of oil transport routes, the protection and defense of energy infrastructure, and military security of other infrastructure, pipelines, ports, tankers, and so on. The whole idea of resource nationalism is the reason why Trump wants Greenland and Canada and threatens them militarily, because he wants their lithium, rare earth elements, and so on. Ultimately, this crisis is not confined to the Middle East, and wars about oil are not confined to simply acquiring those resources, but about maintaining geostrategic control over the global energy system and key regions like the Middle East. So that the Iranian regime retains its stockpile of enriched uranium and its arsenal of missiles and drones, not allowing the US to win, even with the most advanced weaponry in the world by far, and forcing Trump to negotiate with the regime he wanted to annihilate, is again a humiliation for the US. And I think we have to see it that way, and to see its structural weakness, which means also problems for us and the whole world economy and the world order. The consequences will not be borne only, again, by the people of Iran, Lebanon, Palestine, and so on, but for everyone. And although they bear the brunt of it, we are also going to feel the effects. And I think in that context, we absolutely have to argue that there is an alternative to this insanity, that we can refuse to cooperate with our governments in facilitating these wars, that they are part of a capitalist and imperialist system in which we have no stake or no future, and that if there ever was a time to organize against endless war, it's now.